I think a lot of people experience loneliness at some point in their lives, and that is perfectly okay. When it starts becoming chronic over a period of time, I think that's where we need to start thinking differently about that, and then its implications for us in the workplace.
Welcome back to Evolving Your Workplace. I'm Carol Schultz. Today, we're discussing the widespread issue of loneliness in the workplace and how it may be impacting your company without you knowing. If you want to learn more about this issue, or if you are experiencing this in the workplace, this one's for you. So we're currently in a worldwide loneliness epidemic, according to a study which reported that 1 in 4 adults feel lonely across the globe due to social isolation and other factors. And according to Gallup, this is carried over into the workplace, with 1 in 5 workers worldwide saying they are lonely at work, leading to lower rates of productivity and increased rates of turnover and absenteeism. So I am joined today by Dr. Dieter Veldsman, Chief Scientist at the Academy to Innovate HR. Dieter, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Carol. Lovely to be here.
You are welcome. Tell me a little bit more about what you study.
So from my side, from a background point of view, I'm an organizational psychologist, and I focus very much on topics of how do we help organizations build workplaces where people can be engaged as well as organizations can be successful. So a lot of my work in terms of what I do focuses very strongly on organizational development and organizational culture, and then with a specific focus also in terms of my current role on human resource management and the role that human resource management plays in guiding organizations into the future.
Gotcha. So what can you tell us specifically about loneliness among workers? What do you believe is at the root of this?
So I think, Carol, we live in a world that is constantly changing, and we see high levels of ambiguity and high levels of uncertainty. And I think on the other side, even though we have tool sets such as social media these days, we are actually more disconnected than ever when we start thinking about, how people engage with each other, etc. So I think loneliness is something in organizations that are not spoken about, but as the statistics that you've quoted, it is actually quite prevalent. And I think a lot of people experience loneliness at some point in their lives, and that is perfectly okay. When it starts becoming chronic over a period of time, I think that's where we need to start thinking differently about that, and then its implications for us in the workplace and on people's general well-being as well.
Yeah. There were a couple of myths that this article in the Harvard Business Review pointed out, and I want to talk about those things a little bit. Because, I think, in the work that I do around what it looks like to build a talent-centric organization, there are things that I put in place with clients that really should solve a lot of these problems. But one of the myths they said is that loneliness can be solved with in-person work. And they found that to be not the case.
Yeah.
I work from home. I've worked from home since 2002. What's that? 22 years now? It's a long time. So, and if, personally, if I find myself lonely, it's because I am not actively looking to engage in things, right? Yeah. Or I'm spending too much time in social media, to your point.
No, I think definitely. And I think the first thing to mention there is that we should let go of this belief that not being lonely means being with other people. That's not the same thing. So I think you can be, whether that's in person or virtual or online, you can be with other people and still be alone and feel lonely, because it is the subjective experience that you have in terms of feeling disconnected, feeling excluded, not feeling part of. So I think the conversation is much better when we focus on how do I make sure that people can belong to what we want to drive in the organization and believe in what we do? Yeah. So, I definitely support kind of dispelling that particular myth. I think people can be very connected, in terms of the organization's cause and their colleagues and what we're driving, even though they might not be sitting at the same place, when it goes deeper than just the physical location.
Exactly. So like I said, I completely agree with that. I spend a lot of time talking to people during the day. Yeah. You and I are having this conversation, and I've got conversations after this. And, many of them are, on video, right? So I'm still getting that without having to be in an office. Now, that said, do I enjoy being around other people physically? Sure, I do. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that I think the point here, at least for me, is to realize that different people have different needs.
But
so, asking people, I'm a huge advocate of what it means to have a culture of feedback, which is an open culture where anyone can say anything to anyone at any level. Now, you have to often teach people how to speak to people, right? To their coworkers. But ultimately, if the CEO builds a culture where he or she welcomes feedback and no one gets thrown under a bus for that, I can be asked, so, where are you in the loneliness scale? What would help you to feel less lonely? Those types of things.
Yeah, so I think definitely for me, there's a couple of important things that you've mentioned. The first one is, I think it is a subjective experience. So what you might determine to be feeling or experiencing loneliness and what I might have the same experience is going to be very different in terms of how we interpret the world and what's important to us. I definitely agree with you. When we think about organizations, you mentioned the words around how do we create a culture of safety and a culture of feedback. And I think if that is not in place, we start also seeing some of these things like loneliness, imposter syndrome, etc., pop up a lot more frequently, because at its root, I think there's not a healthy trust-based relationship. Now, to your point, sometimes we need to teach people how to engage with each other. We need to make sure that there's open feedback mechanisms and build and breed that trust over time. But I think if that does not exist, I think we start seeing a lot of these different elements that just breaks down. And that's for me, one of the key things is when we start thinking about loneliness, we have to take a systemic approach. There's not one silver bullet that's going to solve that, but we have to start looking at what does the ecosystem look like and what are the foundational pillars there and how can we then address a lot of these things, because it is also a dual responsibility in my view, at least.
Yeah, I completely agree. So, that the other three myths that the article talks about are that teams will solve loneliness, a myth. Lonely employees are needier socially than others at work, and that loneliness is a personal problem, not an organizational problem. I feel like, there is, one of my great coaches said to me, and I say this whenever it's appropriate to say, you don't have business problems, you have personal problems that show up in your business. Right. So when they say that it's a myth that loneliness is a personal problem, not an organizational problem. Right. So if that personal problem ends up landing into your work environment, it's going to affect you in your work environment. Right. So how do we overcome that? And, as we've both talked about, having that culture of feedback, psychological safety, et cetera, is super, super important.
Yeah. And I think for me, I think there is also the differentiation we need to make between, call it personal loneliness or loneliness in my personal life versus in the work environment. But we are one human being that is experiencing both, and they are going to start influencing, one another over time. For me, that last myth, and, you've quoted the statistics earlier around the significant impact that loneliness has on things like absenteeism in the workplace, lack of productivity, lack of employee engagement, higher levels of turnover. So I believe that beyond it being the right thing to do for organizations to create cultures where people want to belong, there is also a very hard business impact argument to be made here, around making sure that the way we work, the environment we create is actually sustainable, and we do speak to some of these issues as well. And I think it's becoming more difficult as work and life is blurring and those boundaries are slowly but surely starting to disappear. I think that's going to become even more important for us. And I always, whenever I speak to clients, have this conversation around saying, but who are the human beings in your organization and what is their context currently? And if you understand that a lot better, I think you can start putting very different things in place, to tackle topics like I've mentioned before, like loneliness, etc.
Yeah. In your opinion, what do you think some of are the things that are causing this issue of loneliness in the workplace?
I think there's a couple of things. I think on the one side, we are in an environment where I think there's a lot of organizations are pushing people really, really hard in terms of what they want them to do. So there's this culture of busyness that is that people are experiencing over time. And I think we've had, in certain parts and in certain industries, we've become so task focused and oriented. If we look at the things that we reward in organizations, that we don't create time and space for real, authentic connection to occur. So, I'm a very big supporter and kind of an area of study around employee engagement. And all the studies still tell us that relationship between a manager and an employee is one of the most important predictors of being engaged. And I actually think we've started breaking that down and taking a lot of the humanness out of that and focusing a lot more on, the busyness of everybody needs to run around doing a lot of things. on the other side, as I've mentioned before, I think it is quite a chaotic environment out there. So there is a lot of looming uncertainty on the horizon. We find talent at the moment. It's not that people don't want to move around, but they kind of try to stay in an organization slightly longer in terms of looking at what's happening in the world outside. Maybe what I know and what I have now is perfectly okay. So I think those things start playing in, that you find a workforce that don't choose to be in your organization, but kind of end up there and don't necessarily want to go anywhere else. And I think that has unintended consequences, like things like loneliness starting to play out as well.
You mentioned about, somebody's manager and managers, we'll use the word manager, but I want to distinguish here the difference between a manager and a leader.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And those are two, in my life, in my world, distinctly different things. Right. So agreed. A manager, all right, let's call that person a manager. And the manager could be a CEO if they manage this way. A manager believes that the employees work for them. A leader believes that they work for the employees.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there's a lot of this in here, right? So in creating a culture of connection, for example, at work, obviously the culture of an organization, and the article talked about this, conveys what's acceptable and valuable, right? And it's incumbent upon your team, your talent and recruiting staff to make sure that as a company, we are clear on what we're looking for culturally, and we have to be aligned, and so on and so forth. There's more of that for a different conversation. But unfortunately, it's that a great many of these lonely participants that participated in this study described their work environment as, quote, toxic, hostile, and biased.
Yeah.
They heard about patterns of lying, malicious gossip, cliques, and prejudiced behaviors, right? So, I mean, it's to me, so sad to hear this, right? It's really impossible to develop any kind of a connected workforce if you've got these kinds of negative things going on, right? So my answer is teach your managers how to be leaders and realize that the employees aren't the ones working for them; they're working for the employee. Yeah. But we have to train them how to do that. That's not innate in everyone.
Yeah, so I agree with that. There's a couple of things for me that, somebody once told me an organizational culture is shaped by what we celebrate and what we tolerate. That's the two things that drives, organizational culture in the longer term.
That. Yeah.
And exactly to your point, when we start thinking about the role of leaders, I've thought for a very long period of time, I think there's something missing and lacking in how we develop a lot of leaders, because people kind of grow up in that managerial type of mindset and the things that we reward, especially when people start stepping into first line manager, middle management type of roles. Yeah. And then, and I'm not saying leadership is tied to seniority, because I believe you have leadership at all levels. But then at some point, we just expect people to make this leap into being inspirational, setting the direction, connecting people to a common cause and to a common vision, where the behaviors that we've rewarded up to now has been very much more transactional in nature.
Yeah.
And, exactly as the article that you've quoted mentions, I think if we have to start focusing on how do we help managers and leaders shape different workplace cultures, and from there, based on solid principles about who we are, why we are, because I think organizational identity is such an important thing to really be able to clarify. And then to be very clear around what does culture add look like. And when I say culture add and not culture fit, so when we do bring new people, what are they adding to the culture aligned to the principles of what we believe? I think if you don't have that conversation, toxic culture is a very difficult systemic thing to cure over time, but cultures rise and fall with leadership behavior, in my view, at least.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir with me, certainly. And what we hope is that the leaders that will be listening to this show will start to understand this, because I cannot tell you how often I run bi-monthly roundtables, executive roundtables for founders and CEOs primarily. Occasionally have somebody else, another CXO join. And I am sometimes shocked when they, we'll be talking about, how much of their time they're spending doing work that they really shouldn't be doing, and why that's the case, and what's causing that, and so on and so forth. I mean, at a very high level, that's an out of alignment organization causing that to happen, right? And that filters down all the way to the hiring process. And, I'm sometimes really surprised when they say, yeah, this is work I'd really love to do. It's just not a priority for me right now. They do not understand that this will actually fix your other problems. Revenues are the number one thing. Right. Yeah. But if you keep having turnover and you keep having people who are not productive, and you have people who are just miserable at work or whatever that might be, it's going to affect your bottom line directly.
Now, there's also for me, I think there's that realization, and, at my heart, I'm an organizational design, practitioner. Yeah. So I sometimes believe that we don't do leaders any favors in how we design the organization. So they get pulled down very often into the, call it transactional, operational type of work that they should not be doing. And then I think that fighting fire syndrome starts to set in quite a bit as well, where they also become, so overwhelmed as part of that. Mm-hmm. The second point is you're absolutely correct. And I think there's a lot of really good research that backs it up in terms of the impact of, various people practices on productivity, performance, customer satisfaction, etc. And it's to help people realize, but to sell it in, I think, from an HR point of view in a very tangible, practical way. What are the things we need to do right? What are the things we need to do well? What are our non-negotiables, as part of that? The last point I want to make here, maybe just to link it to the loneliness topic as well. I find, and some of our own research has shown to us, that when people go into that C-suite leadership role, a lot of them actually start experiencing higher levels of loneliness because all of a sudden I've moved out of my support structure.
That's right.
People look up to me. I might not have established my credibility yet at the C-suite level. Mm-hmm. And I don't really then have that support network of peers if I don't have something outside of the organization. And leadership can be a very lonely place. And I think that then also people then start focusing on, but what are the things I need to do right in order to be successful at this level? And I think that then grows in levels of anxiety and things over time, which is also not great for the well-being of the leader.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic point. There were, and I want to talk about these a little bit, there were a number of things that this article said, here's some solutions to this problem, right? And one was to measure loneliness. And they said, we have yet to meet a manager who systematically assesses work loneliness using a research verified instrument.
Yeah.
I understand the importance of a research verified instrument. However, I also feel like, again, let's just assume that we have a team here that's got this open culture that you can talk to your employees. Wouldn't it just be better to sit down with people one-on-one?
No.
And have a conversation. They said, for example, conducting the survey anonymously. I mean, I hate to say this, but this is such a typical HR thing to say. And it just chaps my ass when I have to hear that. Yeah. Well, let's just give them an anonymous survey. Oh, you know what? I call bullshit on that because, it says it increases the chances of getting accurate data. Maybe, maybe not. Okay. If people don't feel that they have an open culture or truly open culture, I'm not so sure they're going to be that honest.
No, I think that, there's a part that I agree with, and I know where the article is coming from in terms of the positioning around the fact that we need to create awareness and measurement and drive that into the conversation. And, in a lot of businesses to utilize the more data-driven approach helps shift and move the conversation forward. However, where I disagree slightly, a little bit more aligned to what you are saying there is, if you don't have a culture of trust, these things are not going to happen. People are not going to give feedback. That's right. The survey does not solve things in isolation. So for me, I think there's a lot more valuable time that can be spent to educate managers on, firstly, how to spot the symptoms of loneliness in their own teams, how to deal with it in a responsible way that does not further alienate people over time, and then how to have an ongoing conversation and, in your language, to create that culture where people can speak up and somebody can be vulnerable and say, I'm actually going through a bit of a tough time at the moment. And that is why X, Y, Z. And this is what I need to be able to get there. So I think there's a lot more, I want to say, can I say a lot more humanness in that type of approach as opposed to just the cold, let's measure, people are less lonely this week. Yeah. Great. I think it's good to anchor it in something, but for me, it goes deeper, into that engagement.
Yeah. I agree 1,000% on that. And it's also training, your leaders and, to actually pay attention to their employees. Now, if you have a remote or hybrid workforce, you need to have calls with those people. Yeah. Even if you don't do it by video, if you are really a present listener and you are actively listening, right? You are going to hear something in a tone and a voice that says to you, I wonder if something's going on here.
Yeah.
Or, their work seems to be slipping. Gosh, I really need to, instead of calling them and saying, hey, you're behind on this or you're behind on that. Hey, I've noticed this and I'm concerned. Is everything okay?
Yeah.
I grew up, on the cusp of the baby boomers and Gen X. And, we didn't worry about things like that. But I wish we had. Okay. Yeah. The article talks about designing Slack into the workflow. And I'm thinking to myself, well, there was always, even when I was the first 9 years of my career, when I was with the search firm that trained me, there was always Slack in our workflow. You needed to get away from your desk for 10 minutes and go chat with somebody. You just did it. No, nobody was no manager was at your desk, saying, why are you taking, 5 or 10 minutes of a break if you need it? But I have to imagine maybe that's going on now. I don't know.
Yeah, for me, there's also this, I think we have a bit of a fascination. It's not unfounded, but with productivity and what productivity looks like. And I think especially when a lot of people started working remotely, I think, I often make the call to say, I think people can work remotely. I'm not 100% sure people can manage remotely or managers can manage remotely. I think it's a different skill set that we need to help people with. For me, I think that it is important that this fascination is a healthy one around how we allocate work and workload, etc. And I think what they also speak about when they say about Slack, and it comes back to your point, as a manager, part of your role and your responsibility is to spend time with your people so that you can observe the changes in their behavioral patterns. When one of your top performers starts slipping, you can ask the question to say, hang on, what's going on here? Let me probe slightly deeper, as opposed to only being so focused on the outcomes, the impact, the value that we are delivering. And I think there's that balance that we do need to strike. I think at times we veer a little bit too much towards it's only about outcome-based management. I don't care how we get there as long as we get there. And that's what we're going to talk about. But is it sustainable? That's always a question that I ask to say, are you building a healthy ecosystem that is sustainable in the longer term? And are you actually designing time into your managers' roles to spend time with people? Because if you're not, and they're running around, when I was in an executive position, I had, I think, between 50 and 60 meetings a week. I didn't get to any of my direct reports. No. I never spoke to them. I literally maybe spoke to them, in the forums, etc. But that's not a way to lead and manage people. You can't do that for an extended period of time.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that. And I do want to make a point. My chief of staff just sent me an article, and this is something we've been talking about a lot. Sent me an article yesterday on in Business Insider about it's a really bad time to be a middle manager because companies are getting rid of them. Yeah. And she wanted my comments on that, and I have not provided those yet. So I want to provide them here because because of your example of I was spending 50 to 60 meetings a week. I had no time to be with my people. Guess what's going to happen when you start removing layers of managers? Okay. First of all, I think we spend probably we waste 30% of our day in meetings. And also by removing middle managers, right? Not having the ability to have your people led properly. What's gonna end up happening is, I've always said somewhere in the neighborhood of like 5 to 7, maybe 8 direct reports. Yeah. Once you get above 8, it gets challenging to manage your people, to be able to give them what they need, right? If you think that you're there to serve them. Okay. So I have to wonder, as we remove layers, how much it's going to exacerbate the problem you were discussing.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think that, it's such, so I think sometimes middle management, and I mean, there's a lot of things that also speak to that, is one of the toughest gigs to have in an organization, because you get all the complaints from the bottom and you get all the directions and instructions from the top, and you have to make sense of it and translate it to people whilst still managing upwards as part of that. So I think very often we don't scope the manager role really well at that middle level. And then, when I asked the question around, but why are you collapsing layers? What's the driver behind why you actually want to do this?
Financial.
Spot on. It's usually that, right? Or, we don't see what they do with all their time. We have to make that connection that actually the output and success of a middle management role looks very different than some of the metrics that we sometimes utilize. I want to use a practical example of a client we work with. With AI at the moment, they ran this experiment, right? AI is not is a lot more objective than people. Let AI manage the performance of people in those conversations. And that absolutely backfired because people crave that human connection with a manager that can give context, with a manager that can interpret, make sense of all those different elements. And, I fear that we are going to sacrifice the humanness in organizations, which might give, short-term financial gains. But long-term, that's not going to help your organization at all. And I fear that's what we might be steering towards if we don't do this in a responsible and in the right way.
I completely agree. And let me also mention here that I haven't read that article yet, but of course, by the time this airs, I will have, and I will have commented on it, somewhere else as well. But, they talk about building social kind of opportunities into the work rhythm, right? So how do we do that when we have a remote workforce? I know many, many companies, clients of mine that have partially remote workforces, fully remote workforces, and I know what I recommend to them, which is if you've got a remote workforce, I think it's super important to bring your people into one place, wherever that is, every quarter. To spend time together and bond and break bread and have cocktails or whatever that might look like, play games, whatever that is, right? But, how do we build that socializing into the rhythm of work in a remote work environment?
Yeah, I think for me personally, what I also see in the work environment, I definitely agree with your idea of, even though people might be working remotely, we have to, in our cadence and in the rhythm of how our business operates, create opportunities and moments for people to get together. It's great for building relationships. It's great for, being in the same place, to be able to just to get to know each other in a different way. And I think that has to become part of the way that we think about how we plan work, going forward as well. It's not something, and I really have a big beef with this in a lot of organizations where, we haven't had an offsite this quarter yet. Let's quickly pull something together. People need to know that this is part of our rhythm. It's an important thing that we do. And then in there, we have to create authentic time for people really to be able to connect. Team days and all those types of things. It's about spending time together in an authentic way where people feel comfortable, as opposed to, the game or the task or whatever else we put out with regards to that. I think it's also possible to do that online, but I also believe this blended approach is much better to really get people to connect authentically over time.
Yeah. Have you seen in any of the clients that you work with where loneliness is affecting their organizations, and how are you seeing it affect their organizations?
Yeah, so maybe two examples I can use there, right? So as I mentioned before, we work a lot with HR leaders as well as HR departments, and we can definitely see, especially when HR leaders start stepping up, as I mentioned earlier, into that executive role for the very first time, that removal component and that feeling of I'd no longer belong anywhere else. And we see that play out quite significantly in them feeling like they need to establish their credibility in a different way. On the other side, they feel they are not valued in the executive conversations. And then what starts creeping in is this lack of confidence, and almost this cycle then that starts reaffirming itself over time that I'm not good enough. Why am I here? Do I have a voice? And that starts impacting the credibility of something like the HR function, which then has got dire consequences for a lot of the things that we've spoken about now, how seriously human capital gets taken in the organization and how that's linked to that. So we specifically see it with that particular transition there, but also we have clients on the other side where, very often in certain functions, you are a little bit on the outside of what a lot of things that happens in the business. So to make it practical, let's say, again, I'll use an HR example. We're 2 or 3 people in a very kind of medium-sized organization, but we're always kind of on the outside because we deal with things that we can't share. We deal with things that we can't talk about. People have got certain stereotypes and stigmas about us that kind of also perpetuates those types of beliefs. So those are two examples that we can see very, very tangibly, that leads towards this sense and this experience of loneliness. And, the saddest thing for me is then that very often people exit the profession or the organization because they have this misheld perception that I wasn't good enough, even though, that was one of the symptoms of just this experience of loneliness that they had at that point in time.
That's really interesting. What do you recommend? And I think we've talked sort of about this, but, what do you recommend leaders do to combat this within their organizations?
So I think there's for me, it almost works at different levels, right? And at different layers. And I think there is individual things that leaders themselves need to do. I know this is going to sound like common sense, but leaders need to take time to be self-aware and make sense of what's happening with them in the world around them. We've spoken a little bit about taking time to invest in, the relationships that we build and understanding the importance thereof. I think there is also another component that we've touched on for me a little bit around intentionally thinking about the culture we want to create and the consequences of not having certain things in place, and then prioritizing. Your earlier example, I'd love to do that, but it's not priority right now. If it's burning and it's not priority now, you're not going to be able to save it much later. So I think there is a bit of a different conversation there, that does need to happen. And for me, a big thing there is also leaders need to build support structures for themselves. Nobody is an island, so you do need to build support structures, and that looks very different for different people, around navigating loneliness specifically for them in that period and in that context within which they find themselves.
And I want to touch on one final thing, which is, yes, the company has a large responsibility in this, but, where's the accountability of the employee for their own happiness?
Yeah. Spot on, right?
Yeah. I mean, I believe that, again, in creating that culture of feedback, that psychological safety that we both know it's imperative, right? I think in those cases, people may be more apt to speak up for themselves.
Sure.
But if you don't have that, somebody may just feel completely despondent.
Yeah.
Why should I bother? It's not going to make any difference.
I think that is a definite, and I think we see that quite often with, where people feel extremely disconnected, or, we've spoken about management a lot today, but, where they've got a manager that is actually just terrible. We do know that we find that as well.
Plenty of them. Yeah. Right.
I want to come back to your point where it is a dual responsibility, because very often I think, there's this notion of learned helplessness that very often happens in organizations where we just expect the organization to solve the problems for us. We see the same things in well-being. We see the same things in engagement. There has to be, this idea also around how do we help and give people the skills to manage these types of components, but they also need to take ownership of that. I always believe, there's something you can do in any situation, even if it means I make the active choice not to respond or react to something. So I think we have to help people with that type of mindset and to give them much more ownership in the relationship. An organization creates an environment that's the best that an organization can do. But within that, individuals need to take certain choices, if it's really going to work for them and look after themselves.
Yeah. Well, we could go on and talk about this for considerably longer, but we're at the 30-minute mark, so actually a little bit over. So I don't want to get yelled at by my producer. So Dr. Dieter Veldsman, Chief Scientist at the Academy to Innovate HR, thanks so much for joining me. This was a great conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me, and love the conversation.
Thanks for watching Evolving Your Workplace. Do you have a topic you'd like to discuss? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to click subscribe and stay tuned for our upcoming episodes.